For over 1,000 years, the most powerful merchants in the ancient world told everyone the same story. Cinnamon was harvested from the nests of giant, monstrous birds that built their homes on cliffs too high for any human to reach. To get the spice, brave harvesters had to lure the birds away with slabs of raw meat, wait for the nests to collapse under the weight, and gather the fallen cinnamon sticks from the ground. It was completely made up, every word of it, and it worked for centuries. The people telling this story knew exactly where cinnamon came from. They just had a very good reason to make sure nobody else found out. Because the truth, a humble tree growing on an island thousands of miles away, was worth more than gold. Literally. In ancient Rome, a pound of cinnamon could cost 15 times a laborer's monthly wage. This is the story of the greatest marketing lie in the history of food, the colonial wars it eventually triggered, and the reason the cinnamon in your cupboard right now is probably not even real cinnamon. Cinnamon comes from the inner bark of trees in the Cinnamomum genus. You strip the bark, dry it, and it curls into the familiar quills we call cinnamon sticks. The most prized variety, Cinnamomum verum, which literally means true cinnamon, is native to a single place, the island of Sri Lanka, historically known as Ceylon, off the southern tip of India. Humans have craved it for at least 4,000 years. The ancient Egyptians used cinnamon in the mummification process, packing it into bodies to mask the smell of decay and honor the dead. It appears in the Hebrew Bible as an ingredient in sacred anointing oil. The Roman Emperor Nero, when his wife Poppaea died in 65 AD, reportedly burned an entire year's supply of Rome's cinnamon on her funeral pyre, a display of grief so extravagant it was essentially setting a fortune on fire in public. But here's the thing about all these ancient civilizations that loved cinnamon so desperately. None of them knew where it came from. That ignorance wasn't an accident, it was engineered. For most of antiquity, the cinnamon trade was controlled by Arab merchants. They sat at the center of the routes connecting Asia to the Mediterranean, and cinnamon passed through their hands on its way to the wealthy markets of Greece, Rome, and Egypt. These merchants understood a fundamental principle of business that still applies today. If your customers know where your product comes from, they can cut you out and go get it themselves. So the Arab traders made absolutely sure nobody knew. They didn't just stay quiet about cinnamon's origins. They actively invented elaborate, terrifying stories designed to make the source seem impossibly dangerous, impossibly remote, and impossibly guarded. The more outrageous the tale, the less likely anyone would try to trace the spice back to its home. And the ancient world's most respected minds wrote these stories down as fact. The Greek historian Herodotus, often called the father of history, recorded the cinnamon bird legend in the 5th century BC. According to his account, enormous birds gathered cinnamon sticks from some unknown land and carried them to nests fastened high on sheer cliff faces. The Arabians, he wrote, would cut oxen and donkeys into massive chunks of meat and leave them near the cliffs. The birds would swoop down, haul the heavy meat up to their nests, and the weight would cause the nests to break and tumble to the ground, scattering the precious cinnamon for the harvesters to collect. Aristotle repeated the story in his History of Animals, listing the cinnamon bird right alongside real creatures like storks and sparrows. He added his own twist. The harvesters used arrows weighted with lead to shoot the nests down from the trees. By the time you reach later Roman writers, the cinnamon bird had become certain and beyond dispute. Some accounts placed the bird in Arabia, others in India. Some describe the cinnamon growing in shallow lakes, guarded by fierce winged serpents, bat-like creatures that attacked anyone who came near. Others claimed the spice grew in deep valleys, protected by snakes, or in forests sealed off by curses. Each version was more fantastical than the last. And that was the entire point. A spice guarded by monsters, growing at the edge of the world, harvested through near impossible feats of daring. Who would ever try to find the source of that? But not everyone was fooled. In the 1st century AD, the Roman writer Pliny the Elder, a naturalist who tried to catalogue everything known about the world, looked at the cinnamon bird story and called it exactly what it was. He wrote that these tales had been invented by the local traders to raise the price of their goods. He understood that the monsters weren't real. They were a business strategy. Pliny even documented the actual mechanics of the trade, describing how cinnamon was really transported, carried on rafts across the open ocean, riding seasonal winds without sails or oars. He'd figured out that the spice came from far to the east and travelled by sea, not by monster. But Pliny was a voice of reason in an ocean of profitable myth. The cinnamon bird legend was simply too good, too useful, and too entertaining to die. It persisted in European bestiaries and encyclopedias for another 1,000 years. Medieval illustrations still showed men knocking cinnamon bird nests off cliffs well into the 13th century. The lie outlived the Roman Empire itself. The truth slowly leaked out over centuries. Crusaders travelling through Egypt asked about cinnamon and got vague, contradictory answers. One chronicler was told it was fished out of the Nile in nets at the edge of the world. But in 1292, an Italian missionary named John of Montecorvino sent a letter back from his travels describing something far more accurate. Cinnamon came from a tree grown in Sri Lanka and was carried by rafts to East Africa, then passed north through a chain of middlemen, each one adding their own markup, until it finally reached Venice. The Venetians had by then taken over as the great cinnamon middlemen of Europe, distributing it from the port of Alexandria and guarding their monopoly just as jealously as the Arab traders before them. And that stranglehold, the endless markups, the secrecy, the sheer cost of getting spices to Europe, became one of the driving forces behind the age of exploration. Because eventually, Europe stopped wanting to pay the middlemen. They wanted to find the source themselves. In 1505, the Portuguese reached Ceylon, and when they realized they were standing in the actual homeland of true cinnamon, the source that had been hidden behind monsters and myths for over 1,000 years, they did what colonial powers did. They took it. The Portuguese established forts, seized control of the cinnamon-growing regions, and forced the local Sinhalese population to harvest cinnamon as a tribute under military occupation. For over a century, they monopolized the world's supply. Then, in 1638, the Dutch arrived. The Dutch East India Company, the most powerful corporation in the world at the time, moved in on the Portuguese, took control of the cinnamon manufactories by 1640, and expelled the last of the Portuguese by 1658. The Dutch were even more ruthless about protecting the trade. They controlled production with an iron grip, and they were known to burn huge stockpiles of cinnamon to keep supply artificially low and prices artificially high. They would destroy the very thing they'd conquered an island to control just to keep it scarce. The British took over in 1796. By then, cinnamon cultivation had spread beyond Ceylon. Prices had finally begun to fall, and the spice that had once been guarded by imaginary monsters was on its way to becoming an ordinary kitchen staple. Which brings us to the cinnamon in your cupboard, and a final twist that most people never learn. There are two very different spices sold under the name cinnamon. The first is Cinnamomum verum, true Ceylon cinnamon, the original, delicate, honey citrus spice that ancient empires fought and lied over. The second is Cinnamomum cassia, a cheaper, harsher relative native to China and Indonesia. Roughly 90% of what's sold as cinnamon in North American supermarkets is actually cassia. It's darker, thicker, and more pungent, and it's what most people in the West think cinnamon is supposed to taste like. But it isn't the real thing. The spice that launched exploration, funded empires, and inspired 1,000 years of monster myths is mostly absent from the average kitchen. And there's a health reason to care. Cassia contains high levels of a natural compound called coumarin, which can be harmful to the liver in large amounts. A teaspoon of cassia contains dramatically more coumarin than a teaspoon of true Ceylon cinnamon. The European Food Safety Authority sets strict daily limits on coumarin intake precisely because so many people are consuming cassia without knowing it. The cheap imitation isn't just less flavorful. In quantity, it can actually be bad for you. 4,000 years ago, cinnamon was worth more than gold and guarded by imaginary birds the size of eagles. Empires embalmed their dead with it, burned fortunes of it at funerals, and sailed across the planet to find its source. Wars were fought over a tree bark. Colonies rose and fell over it. Today it sits in a jar on a spice rack, costs a couple of dollars, and most of us reach for it without a second thought, often grabbing a cheaper substitute that isn't even the real spice. The monsters were never real, but the lie they protected built trade empires, launched the age of exploration, and reshaped the world. All to keep secret the location of a tree that, it turns out, just grows on an island.